World politicians have been preparing for this day for months, the day Donald Trump returns to the White House. In Europe, his presidency is expected to have a big impact, with Ukraine, NATO and trade relations all featuring. So, who will the new president turn to build alliances? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has already positioned herself as a key ally in Europe for the new US President Donald Trump. Relations with the EU have already been shaken with threats of trade tariffs, while his remarks about Greenland suggest he's even prepared to challenge European territorial sovereignty. So, who will be Trump's allies in Europe and who might push back?
Just weeks before his inauguration, Donald Trump hosted the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni at his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida. Seen as a key European ally for the new president, Meloni described the meeting as beyond expectations.
Unlike some opinions that sometimes I hear about Donald Trump, we have already seen Donald Trump as the US president. So we are facing a person who, when he does something, he does it for a reason.
But not all European leaders share Meloni's enthusiasm.
Many things will certainly be different under a government led by Donald Trump. Donald Trump has always made that clear publicly.
Germany's Olaf Scholz, along with France's Emmanuel Macron, have called for a deeper EU cooperation to make Europe less reliant on the United States. But President Macron wasted little time in welcoming Trump to Paris, inviting him to Notre Dame's reopening ceremony in December.
We had a lot of success, really great success, working together on defense and offense too. And it certainly seems like the world is going a little crazy right now, and we'll be talking about that.
A meeting with President Zelensky to discuss the war in Ukraine was also hosted by Macron. It is hoped that Trump can help bring about peace, but there are concerns over his ties with Russia's President Putin. Meanwhile, Europe's far-right parties are hailing Trump's victory as a turning point. Germany's AfD, France's National Rally, and Spain's Vox all see Trump as an inspiration, as well as Trump's ally Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister. A second Trump presidency has the potential to either divide Europe further or bring it closer together. Who will build bridges with Trump, and who will he seek to align in Europe?
Well, let's bring in our guests on this one. In Brussels, we have the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General, Jamie Shea. In Paris, Gesine Weber. She is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And in Nashville, in the United States, former presidential advisor, Steve Gill. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Steve, I'll come to you first. Is Europe about to embark on a golden age for right-wing politicians who are likely to get a lot more airtime and audience time with Donald Trump?
Well, I think part of it is going to be because of the personal relationships with Donald Trump. And I think world leaders should recognize pretty quickly that Trump puts personal relationships sometimes ahead of policy. And we're seeing that with Meloni in Italy. We're certainly seeing it in Argentina with Milieu. The personal relationships are going to guide a lot of Trump's policies with different world leaders. And I think those that are recognizing that early are going to see the benefits. I think that's where we're going to see improved relations with Russia via Putin, with China via Xi. Although there are policy differences, I think those personal relationships are going to be something that Trump and these world leaders can build upon.
And Jamie, just on that point, these leaders and these relationships, I mean, Viktor Orban of Hungary has been very quick out of the starting blocks with Trump. Giorgia Meloni seems to have a very good relationship. And less so some of what we would have considered the more traditional countries in Europe to have relations with the United States, like France, the United Kingdom, Germany. They all seem to be kind of lagging behind.
Well, Enda, I think that now that President Trump is going to be inaugurated and starting, you'll see obviously a lot of European leaders going to Washington to talk to him and to establish a relationship. Several of them, and Giorgia Meloni has been mentioned already, but also the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has been in Mar-a-Lago. Several of them have made the journey already. And so whether you're sort of on the populist right in European politics or not, as long as you're a leader of a European country, you know you have to deal with him. For example, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, has been contacting Trump in recent days about Greenland and how to have cooperation there. So I don't think it's a question, Enda, that only if you're on the populist right can you have a dialogue or a relationship with Trump. I think all leaders will find some way of doing it and some way of appealing to Trump in terms of mutual interest, whether it be in security or whether it be trade. But we do face, yes, an uncertain landscape because we have presidential elections coming up in Poland in a month or so. We also have an election in the Czech Republic where the populist right could come back to power. Obviously, you mentioned Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland and the elections there. So judging by how those elections go, we'll have, if you like, a centre right or a right in European politics. But I think everybody, whether they're on the socialist left or the populist right, will try to find some kind of modus vivendi on a transactional basis with the new US president.
Gesine, I keep reading this phrase, Trump whisperers, these European politicians who will have his ear. Is he likely to listen to them?
That is a very good question. Only Donald Trump himself can answer, I think. But I would absolutely concur with what my co-speakers have said. What is important is really that Europeans seek to engage with the new US administration. And not only that they seek to engage with the US administration, also that they coordinate before doing so, and that they clearly bring a European offer to the table. Because we know that Donald Trump is particularly keen to listen when you bring a good offer. So if Europeans want him to listen, they need an offer.
Steve, just on that point, how important is Europe from the American perspective? I mean, we see so much of your news, your politics, your current affairs. Do you think Trump really cares about what's in Europe or what's there for him?
I think he cares more about putting America first, which has been his whole agenda. And I think that's the pivot that we're going to see in the world. I think people are asking sometimes, how is he going to actually affect things with Iran? How is he going to affect things with the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Well, first of all, he's going to close the checkbook. He's going to change the 4-digit PIN number for the anytime teller machine so that foreign leaders, NATO or anybody else, can't keep digging their hands at free will into the pockets of American taxpayers. So he's going to clamp down on the checkbook. And that's going to be the biggest thing that he's going to do that's going to impact, relations with Europe, relations with individual countries. The idea of continuing to give billions of dollars in many cases to countries that hate us is going to come to an end very quickly.
Jamie, that's a very good point there that Steve makes, that we know we've got the message, we've been hearing it for months and months, America first. I mean, Europe, it's going to take second stage, isn't it? It's really, really going to take a back seat.
Well, let's wait and see, because Donald Trump has got the priority, of course, of trying to establish peace in Ukraine, and that's, of course, a hot European issue. And the EU and the United States remain each other's largest trading partners, at least on a block-to-block basis, with billions of dollars of mutual investment. So I don't think Trump can ignore Europe. A couple of things in response to what Steve said. I think that clearly, first of all, Biden already set a procedure, a train of America first. He didn't articulate it quite in the way that Trump does, but we had things like the Inflation Reduction Act, massive American subsidies to their own industries, also attracting business from Europe over to the States. So, Europe for some time has had to adapt to a more unilateralist, more self-interested America. I don't think Trump is going to start this process. It's been ongoing for a while. And over here in Brussels, this issue of how Europe can be more self-reliant in defense, through more European defence cooperation, do more for Ukraine, because, of course, Europe has spent more on Ukraine than the United States, if you count humanitarian aid. So I think we're seeing a trend rather than a new beginning. The other thing, though, is don't forget that, Trump will obviously want to have leverage over Putin if he's going to get him to come to the negotiating table. He can't be seen as sort of caving in to a peace entirely dictated by the Kremlin.
Gesine, just looking at Europe's leaders, Giorgia Meloni seems to be very well placed in all of this for a positive relationship with Donald Trump. I mean, she's a strong leader, she's a woman, she's a very good communicator, and her rhetoric kind of matches a lot of what he has said over the years.
Yes, I agree with you on the fact that she might be indeed well positioned, and we have seen that she was among the first contacts that Donald Trump has been activating in Europe. So I think that she's going to become very pivotal for Europe's relationship with the United States. But we also know that Donald Trump has a very strong flavor for politics with strong male leaders in particular. And I think that is really a factor that we have seen during his first presidency, that there was always a certain problem with engagement with female leaders. And I think in this regard, we must also not forget that we have a leader in the European Union who was already there during Trump's first presidency, and this is French President Macron. Even if he is now domestically weakened, I think that there's still significant potential for him to lead a European response, or basically to steer a European initiative towards the United States, simply because he already has this personal relationship. And he has already worked with Trump politically as well, more so than Meloni, for example, has. And I think the fact that Macron managed to set up this bilateral meeting or trilateral meeting, because he was also at the table, between Trump and Zelensky on the sidelines of the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral, which was also attended by Trump in his first foreign trip after the election, I think is a very strong signal as well.
Steve, European leaders will be falling over themselves in the coming weeks to invite Donald Trump to visit. What do you think he will do? Where is he going to go first?
You've seen again, as was just mentioned, Prime Minister Meloni from Italy establishing a strong rapport with Donald Trump. I would not be surprised if Italy wasn't one of the first. Again, I think the personal relationships are going to be key with building a foundation with Donald Trump, and she certainly has a bit of a head start. It's interesting as you look at the political turmoil in Europe. As you see governments transitioning or perhaps soon to transition, a lot of it is MAGA type populism and dealing with some of the same issues that thrust Trump back into the White House, illegal immigration being one of the top ones, economic uncertainty. So I think that you've got Nigel Farage in London, who's done about everything but print up mega hats, make England great again hats, and I think you're seeing that same sort of populist push play out in most of Europe, and if they're following that Trump blueprint, it looks like it might be working.
Jamie, I want to talk about Germany. Do you get the impression the Germans are being held back on this front in terms of building relationships with the Trump administration, while domestically they've got very uncertain weeks ahead until this election at the end of next month?
Well, certainly Germany is not doing well economically. It's in recession for the second year, and there's been uncharacteristic political instability with different views in the coalition and more parties in the coalition. So we have to wait and see how Germany emerges. But at the moment, despite all of the talk of the tidal wave of right-wing populism, the CDU is in the lead quite convincingly in the polls. And recently, Enda, just in the last couple of days, has increased its lead. So we may may go back to a more traditional centre-right coalition in Germany. But economic reform, economic strength, of course, is what Trump respects, and it's going to be key. And I think in terms of transatlantic relations, it's going to be the willingness of Germany to stick with 2% of its GDP on defence, even go above that. It's interesting, for example, that some German politicians are now mentioning the need for Germany to spend 3 or 3.5% of its GDP on defence. I would never have experienced that a few years ago. So the ability to hold the course there and also lead Europe into a greater self-reliance. But one other point, if I may, one advantage for Europe may be the fact that Trump is surrounding himself with these tech giants and billionaires. For example, it was said a moment ago that he likes to deal with strong men, but Giorgia Meloni, by doing a deal with Elon Musk and SpaceX for military satellite intelligence business, or Google, which has 80% of its search engine business in Europe, in the EU, these people are very much fixated on the usefulness of Europe as a business partner. They make big profits there. And as long as they remain in Trump's circle and have the ear of the president, the ability of Europe to influence the people around Trump may be more important than being able to influence Trump directly himself.
Gesine, we've seen Elon Musk cheerlead for the AfD in Germany. He struck up this strange relationship with Alice Weidel, cheerleading everything she does and giving her a huge platform. Do you think that's a political relationship Trump might take further if Weidel does well in the elections at the end of next month?
Well, I think this is something that has to be seen. But as we already see that the links are going to be established now by Musk and Weidel, I think that at least Weidel would, of course, be very keen if she ends up in parliament, and this is almost safe to say, to keep these links. But I would also like to come back to something that Jamie just said, and I think that is more interesting on the German case, which is the debate of German defense spending. And yes, of course, I think we wouldn't have heard things like Germany going up to 3% defense spending a few years ago. But I think it is also absolutely crucial to underline here that this is much easier said when you're in the opposition than done when you're in government. Because Germany going up to defense spending of 3% would basically mean spending around 120 billion per year on defense matters. And I do not see, knowing German strategic culture and knowing the German civil society debates, how any government will be able to sell this measure to the German population once there are debates, for example, also on cuts regarding social spending or spending on education or culture.
Very good point, Gesine, and thank you for your insight on that one. Steve, to you, we know Donald Trump is all about the deal, the art of the deal, America first, what's in it for him. What do you think he will be looking for from European countries over the next 4 years? Basically, business and good terms for America?
Well, and as Jamie mentioned earlier, trade and business with Europe and the rest of the world is going to be a top priority for Trump. I think he's going to want fairness. You know, we have a system that for too long has allowed other countries to block U.S. products, to, in the case of China, often steal our technology and intellectual property. And at the same time, I think China's now looking at about a $1 trillion trade benefit surplus for them. I think Trump's going to try to balance the scales, that if you keep our goods, products, and services out of your country, we're going to reciprocate unless we get fair treatment in terms of trade. So I think trade's going to be a top priority, doing business. And as to the comments that have been made about strong women and Trump dealing with them, his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, is an extraordinarily strong woman. I think she's going to be the first female chief of staff for a president. And anybody who thinks Pam Bondi, the incoming attorney general, is going to be a shrinking violet hasn't paid attention to her and her career.
Thank you, Steve. Jamie, when you hear what Steve was just saying about trade surplus and China doing so well at the cost of the United States, when you hear it put so eloquently, Trump's got a point, hasn't he?
Well, certainly he's right to the extent that the United States has a trade deficit with the EU, although not in services, believe it or not, where America has a surplus. So, and of course, it's more with certain countries than it is with others. But so I think, yes, Europe has to sort of look at that. But there are also interests for Trump as well in sticking to the rules. For example, under the previous Biden administration, a deal was done with the EU and the United States on removing the frictions over Airbus, Boeing subsidies on steel and aluminium, a truce there. There's also, of course, a Trade and Technology Council, which the EU and the United States established to look at harmonizing standards, for example, on supply line resilience, on raw material autonomy, on data exchanges. And if Trump can be persuaded not to ditch all of that and keep that work going, and the EU and the US can agree on those common standards and set those standards, then together I think that's going to be a very, very, very powerful lever in terms of their dealings with China.
Gesine, should we be worried in Europe that many countries are struggling economically at the moment? I mean, Germany flatlining, France saddled with debt, UK no growth whatsoever anywhere, and Trump is coming in as he does, all powerful, next 4 years, nothing can stop him in his mind's eye. And yet Europe is really kind of going backwards, if anything. Should we be worried?
I think what Europeans really have to be worried about on the short term is balancing their economic and security priorities and see how both of them can go together. Because on the very short term, of course, there is an economic challenge that Europeans need to address, but this economic challenge is also directly intertwined to the security challenge that Europeans are facing on their very own continent, which is the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I think if there is one thing that is safe to say, that is that Europeans will have to step up the support for Ukraine because they do not see the United States doing that. And the very tough debates that Europeans now need to have among themselves and among governments and societies is basically how this effort is going to be financed. And I would say, yes, of course, governments domestically have to do their homework, but there is also a massive role for the EU to play. And one could, for example, also think about a format like joint borrowing, as it has been done, for example, for COVID, or to tackle the ramifications of the energy prices after the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, so that one could give a massive boost to European defense from the EU level, while states continue reforming their domestic economic models.
Steve, we're approaching the 3rd anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. How big a prize do you think that is personally for Donald Trump if he were to be the peacemaker, the politician who brought them to the table and sorted everything out? How big a deal would that be personally for Trump?
I think it'd be huge, and I think we've already seen kind of the first step towards that with the ceasefire agreement in the Middle East, the return of hostages. I think that sends a strong message that Donald Trump is accomplishing things before he's even back in the White House. And the ability to bring the end to hostilities in Russia and Ukraine will have a huge economic benefit, both for the U.S. and for Europe. Energy policy, all of those things are going to be tied closely to what happens next. And I think that Trump is going to have that at the top of his list. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that while Europe is concerned, I wouldn't say worried, I'd say concerned about a new Trump administration, the U.S. and the EU should also be focused very heavily on the impact that BRICS could have economically. It is a huge growing economic power that I think, unfortunately, the U.S. and the European Union are not really paying enough attention to in terms of the economic threat that it poses, just in terms of more competitiveness.
Jamie, we've known he's been coming back for a long time now. There's a mixture of skepticism, concern, fear in some quarters in Europe. But do you accept that perhaps Donald Trump's return might actually do some good for the continent and bring people together?
Well, certainly, if you speak to Trump, and I have done at least when he was president the last time round and I was still at NATO, he would actually claim credit not for destroying NATO, but for saving it. He would take the view, and I think with some justification, that he used shock therapy and some sort of rough tactics, but he did get the Europeans to spend more. When he was first in the White House, only 3 European allies spent 2% on defence, and he returns with 27 allies spending 2% on defence. Now, he's not going to be happy with that, but many European politicians, as I pointed out earlier, and not just the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, are making the case that with a more dangerous security environment, 2% isn't enough either, and that level has to be pushed up, and we'll see what NATO does at its summit in June with 3% or 3.5. I think what Trump is asking for of 5% is probably not going to be realistic, and even the United States doesn't spend that, 3.4% of its GDP on defence. So on the one hand, yes, you could argue that, just like people used to say in the old days, that Stalin was the father of NATO because he created that energy, that fear that drove the Allies together. You could say that Trump is also going to be a father of European unification to the extent that he's encouraging the Europeans to realise that they can depend not so much on the United States as they did, and Steve has pointed that out, but they've got to come together, and both economically in terms of rediscovering their economic mojo and in defence and security, in really putting their resources together and standing on their own feet. But of course, if that can be done in partnership with the United States rather than with a divorce with the United States, that's going to make for a much more secure Europe and a much happier world.
Gesine, final point to you. Europe needs to get its act together. That's what we've learned from this roundtable.
Yeah, that's definitely what we have learned from this roundtable. And I think it's not only Europe has to get its act together, but also European has to act together. So the focus is not only about moving ahead, the focus should also really be on European unity. Because if 27 countries in the EU, plus a few more if you count the European NATO members, speak with a joint or a common voice in Washington, that has obviously much more leverage than it has when countries formulate individual demands that might potentially also diverge from each other. So I would say the most important now is for Europeans to think about a coherent European answer and also really an ambitious European offer for European security and competitiveness, because that is what Washington will expect from them. If Europeans do not want Washington to just impose its vision on how European security should look like.
Gesine, thank you, and to Steve and Jamie as well. Superb. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.